This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 926 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Underdog is the best place to play fantasy sports. You can open up the app or go to the site. You can play Pick'em or Champions Mode, or if you're like me, you can join some snake drafts for each week's slate of games. During October, Underdog's running a different promo every single day with Boosttober. You can take advantage of those promos by signing up today. And if you sign up now, you'll also get access to my rest of season rankings. Those are updated in season every Tuesday. All you have to do is head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. Sign up, and when you do, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you access to these promos, a deposit bonus, and my rest of season rankings. Those rankings will be emailed to you from Underdog. I know I sit here and I talk about Underdog before every episode, but I'm telling you, it's so much fun. I play on there all the time. Check it out now and make sure when you sign up, you use promo code LATEROUND. Sell Najee Harris. So Jaylen Warren returned for the Steelers in week 6, and then obviously Najee Harris goes out and he has his best performance of the season. You gotta love fantasy football. But this is why we look at peripherals. This is why we look at more than just fantasy points scored. Harris gave us an RB1 performance for the first time all year, but his running back rush share was just 58.3%. That was a season low. He ran a route on 39% of Pittsburgh's dropbacks. That number was hovering the 60 to 65% range without Jaylen Warren. Harris also played less than half of Pittsburgh's snaps against Vegas. To me, there's no doubt that this matchup against the Raiders, that's what helped Harris do what he did in week 6. It was a favorable matchup, and he came through. He looked good. Things just won't be that easy moving forward. Not only do the Steelers get the Jets in week 7, but they have the third toughest schedule for running backs from here on out, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. We should be worried about Jaylen Warren, and we should be worried about some of these upcoming matchups. So to me, Najee Harris, a pretty clear sell. Add Isaac Guerendo. I'm going to assume that a lot of waiver wire columns, they're going to be pretty bullish on Guerendo this week. And while I do think that you should try to add him, I would hesitate to spend a lot of my budget on him this week, or my top waiver priority. First off, Jordan Mason, who's got this shoulder issue, he might not be out very long. He's considered day-to-day right now. And even if he can't go in week 7, the 49ers, they get the Chiefs. Kansas City's been the toughest matchup for running backs this year. And then on top of that, Guerendo wouldn't just take on Jordan Mason's role. In week 6, Patrick Taylor ended up running more than twice the number of routes as Guerendo. And we'd likely see more work out of that backfield in that area of the field out of Kyle Juszczyk and Deebo Samuel if Jordan Mason misses time. So yeah, go ahead and go get Isaac Guerendo. He's a freakishly athletic running back. He kind of comped to Isaiah Pacheco in my prospect model. He's in one of the best situations imaginable. But I think it's very, very important to temper expectations. Add Romeodobs. So a few weeks ago, you guys might remember that I talked about Romeodobs as a buy candidate because Jordan Love was coming back. The entire passing attack for the Packers was going to get a bump. Everyone was rightfully on Jayden Reed. I was on Jayden Reed too. But Dobbs is kind of like a low-key buy because he was running the most routes on that team. He was going to give you the most consistent opportunity outside of Jayden Reed. And then Dobbs had his off-the-field issues in week 5, but he came through in week 6. He had a multi-touchdown day. His target share was only 13%, but he once again ran the most routes at wide receiver for the Packers. No Green Bay player right now has a 20% target share or better on the season. They're spreading things out. But Dontavian Wicks is now banged up. And Green Bay gets the Texans, the Jags, and the Lions over their next 3. Those are 3 top 10 favorable matchups for wide receivers, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. Romeodobs needs to be rostered in way more than 35% of Yahoo leagues. And hopefully, because I talked about him on last week's Sleepers episode, hopefully he's already on your roster. Buy DK Metcalf. So it's been a rough couple of weeks for DK Metcalf. In week 5, he had a 4-catch, 55-yard line against the Giants, but he only scored 7.5 PPR points because he fumbled. In week 6, he had 11 targets, which is great, but he only had 3 catches. That was his lowest reception total of his career in a game where he saw double-digit targets. The thing is, though, this Seattle environment is really good for fantasy purposes. Depending on how you measure it, the Seahawks right now have the highest pass rate over expected in the entire NFL. Geno Smith has 27 more pass attempts than any other quarterback in football. Even if DK Metcalf hovers at like 22% target share range, that's going to come from a really big pie. He's already had 3 games this year with 10 plus targets. He's averaged 3.4 of those games per year since entering the league. And I know that no one really wants to hear this, but DK Metcalf does have contingent upside. You guys are just sick of that phrase. But an injury to Tyler Lockett, an injury to Jackson Smith-Njigba, that could force more targets DK Metcalf's way. So I think overall, things should normalize a bit for DK Metcalf moving forward. Add Kanani Videl. So as a lot of you know, I like Kanani Videl. I liked him a lot as a prospect. So it was really good to see him get some run in this Chargers offense now that Gus Edwards is on IR. It just would have been nicer for him to see a bigger backfield share than what he saw in week 6. J.K. Dobbins ended up playing about 3/4 of the Chargers snaps, and because of this run-heavy script, he had 25 rush attempts. Videl only had 4. Now, Videl did have a nice touchdown reception that could earn more playing time. Hopefully they see that, hopefully they look at the tape, and they like what they see. He ran a route on about 26% of LA's dropbacks. He is a do-it-all back. That's part of the intrigue here. And we know that J.K. Dobbins hasn't been the healthiest running back throughout his career. So there is a chance here that as Videl gets more reps, he'll steal more and more of this backfield. J.K. Dobbins can't see 25 rush attempts every single game. That can't be good for his body. So maybe Videl gets a flex-worthy role in deeper formats, all while having that injury upside. Add DeAndre Johnson. So last week I talked about Tank Bigsby being a sell. And honestly, I think he might be even a better sell now because Travis Etienne is banged up with a hamstring injury. He left Sunday's game in London with that injury. He's now week to week. Now, Tank Bigsby is going to see more work without Travis Etienne. But what's that workload really going to look like? Because Etienne missed a lot of that game in London, and Bigsby was out-snapped by DeAndre Johnson by a lot. Now, that was definitely game script related, but that's kind of the point. There was this negative game script, and Jacksonville deployed Johnson as their pass-catching back. Johnson ran a route on 56% of the team's dropbacks. Bigsby was at 16%. Now, we can't assume that Jacksonville is going to split their backfield identically to how they split it in week 6. And we also can't assume that they're going to see this ultra negative game script again. But we can recognize the possibilities here, the range of outcomes. And a very real outcome here is that Tank Bigsby is just the early down back for Jacksonville. He could be game scripted out. He has 1 target this season. And that's where DeAndre Johnson becomes more attractive as a fantasy option. Maybe not in week 7 because they get the Patriots. They could see a positive game script. But week 8 and week 9, the Jags get the Packers and the Eagles. Those are 2 teams that they could easily trail against. And again, if they're trailing, if they're in these negative game scripts, that's going to probably benefit DeAndre Johnson more than Tank Bigsby. Johnson's going to be out there on a lot of waiver wires. I think in PPR formats especially, he's worth a look. Buy David Njoku. Look, I understand that it's tough to buy anything Cleveland Browns related right now, but the tight end landscape, it looks horrible. And David Njoku is at least an interesting option within that landscape. He played his first full game in week 6 since an early season injury. He ended the week with the highest pre-Monday Night Football target share of any tight end in football. He only had 8.1 PPR points, but that's why there's a buying opportunity. According to adjusted fantasy points allowed, Cleveland's tight end schedule in the short term is 4th best in football. Rest of season, it's the absolute best. Now is kind of an interesting time to trade for David Njoku. And who knows, maybe they do make a quarterback change eventually. Just don't hold your breath. Add Bubby Means. I'll be honest with you guys, I didn't really like Bubby Means as a prospect, despite the fact that he went to Pitt and I'm a Pitt alum. I just thought he profiled mostly as a deep threat at the next level. And maybe that's where things are going to settle. But he looked decent in week 6. Chris Olave is dealing with another concussion. He suffered that concussion very early in that game for the Saints. And Bubby Means stepped in and he played as the number 2 wide receiver for New Orleans. He had a 21% target share and he scored a touchdown. Chris Olave doesn't have the best documented history with concussions. There's a chance that this is a multi-week thing. And Rashid Shaheed is dealing with a knee injury. And on paper, the matchup for Bubby Means this week on Thursday night, it's not great. They get Denver. But Patrick Surtain, he's also dealing with a concussion. So the matchup's a little bit better. But if Olave misses a lot of time, if he's out for multiple weeks, Bubby Means is the one who's going to benefit most. Add Sean Tucker. So if you listened to my prospecting stuff a couple of years ago when Sean Tucker was coming out, then you know that my models really like Tucker. He went undrafted because of medical reasons, though, and he's kind of buried on that Buccaneers depth chart. But to me, the talent was never a question. And we saw that in week 6. He got an opportunity with Rachaad White sidelined. He carried the ball 14 times for 136 yards and a touchdown. And then, through the air, he had 3 catches for 56 yards and a score. Sean Tucker had 34 PPR points in week 6. Now, it should be noted that if you look at the stat lines of Sean Tucker versus Bucky Irving, they look pretty identical in terms of volume, in terms of usage. But Bucky Irving played 21 more snaps and he ran 14 more routes. But even still, Sean Tucker dominated on Sunday. And regardless of the competition and how this backfield really unfolds, because we don't know exactly how this is going to unfold, but regardless of all of that, we should try to roster a player coming off of this kind of performance who has the kind of backbone that Sean Tucker does, which is a really good player who unfortunately fell due to medicals. But yeah, in the end, the Buccaneers backfield is probably going to be pretty messy. Like really messy. Todd Bowles even talked about that on Monday. He came out and he said that this is probably going to be a 3-headed monster in the backfield. But guys, injuries are inevitable and players can emerge. Tucker doesn't have to be a high priority off the waiver wire, but in deeper formats, I think that you should take a shot. Sell Joe Mixon. Now look, throughout my career as a fantasy analyst, I've been more pro Joe Mixon than anti Joe Mixon. I've always thought that how he looks doesn't always match up with his inefficient numbers. And it takes talent to carry the workloads that he's carried. And this season, he is balling out. He's averaging 5.5 yards per carry, and in his 2 completed games, he scored 26.8 and 27.2 PPR points. We live in a world where not many running backs have that kind of ceiling. So I understand if you have Joe Mixon, I understand if you don't want to get rid of him. I'm not saying you absolutely have to do this transaction, but there are some things that I do want to point out. Right now, his target share per game rate has been solid, but not elite. It's about 11%. He also only handled 52% of the team's running back rushes in week 6. Now that was likely related to game script and probably related to his injury, but it's still noteworthy. He only carried the ball 13 times. He just had 102 yards. He's now, based on his touches and where he's seeing his touches, he's outplayed his fantasy points per game expectation according to PFF by 3.6 PPR points per game. The Houston Texans have also faced the easiest schedule for running backs so far this year, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. Mixon's played in 2 full games. In those games, he faced 2 top 8 matchups, advantageous matchups. And that's according to adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. Things are not going to be that easy in the coming weeks. They get an average opponent when they face Green Bay in week 7, and then it's another easy one against the Colts in week 8. So maybe you want to wait until week 9 to trade Mixon away. That's fine. That's up to you. But when looking at rest of season schedules through the lens of adjusted fantasy points allowed, Houston running backs have a bottom 10 schedule. And in the fantasy playoffs, they have the second worst schedule. In weeks 16 and 17, they get the Chiefs and the Ravens. Those are 2 horrific matchups. So this really comes down to a couple of things. Mixon's going to regress to some degree. And if you're looking ahead, his matchup environment won't look as good. He's got a good shot to finish as an RB1. This transaction is more so about selling high, like selling very high, if you can get an elite price for him. And don't just think in terms of running backs. When I say this about players, people are always like, okay, which running back do you want to swap for Joe Mixon? That's not what this is about. Look at your team and look at your team needs. If you can get an elite wide receiver for Joe Mixon, then get an elite wide receiver for Joe Mixon based on your teams. This transaction is to say that Joe Mixon is probably going to regress. He's almost definitely going to regress. And the schedule does get more difficult for that backfield. That's why I'm calling him out as a sell. Add Michael Wilson. So Marvin Harrison Jr. also suffered a concussion in week 6, and that led to Michael Wilson being the team's top wideout. He ran around a 94% of Arizona's dropbacks against the Packers. That was the season high. Now we'll see how Marvin Harrison Jr. progresses through concussion protocol. As we know, every player is going to be different. But Wilson's not a bad player to have rostered regardless. Heading into their week 6 game, he had 3 straight games with at least a 20% target share. He was trailing Harrison Jr. by just 2 targets during that stretch. The Cardinals have a brutal schedule for their passing attack upcoming, but Wilson still deserves a look. Buy Dak Prescott. So I was thinking about this. After week 5 last year, on this 15 Transactions podcast, I talked about buying CeeDee Lamb because the Cowboys had played in so many weird games, and it resulted in some weird numbers for Lamb. And they had a great upcoming schedule. From that point forward, CeeDee Lamb averaged over 23 PPR points per game. I mean, he was a league-winning player. Now, I'm not saying that history is going to repeat itself here. It's just funny that we're talking about the Cowboys' passing attack almost exactly 1 year later. But things have been different this year. The Cowboys' defense, and we can blame injuries, we can blame whatever we want to blame. The defense has largely been bad. And Dak Prescott, he's thrown the ball plenty. That was kind of a problem last year with those weird game scripts. It's not really a problem this year. This is more of a situation where the team has just underperformed versus expectation. But one thing that is similar to last year is that the schedule does get better for this passing attack. So far this year, Dallas quarterbacks have faced a bottom 10 schedule in adjusted fantasy points allowed. From here on out, it's the 5th easiest. After their bye this week, Dallas will face 2 bottom half matchups for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. Both of those games are against the Eagles. That's a team that currently ranks as the 12th toughest matchup for quarterbacks. So it's not even that difficult of a matchup. And in the fantasy playoffs, the Cowboys get the Panthers and the Buccaneers in 2 of their 3 games. Those are 2 very beatable defenses. So after such a bad performance in week 6, and with the Cowboys on a bye this week, you can probably buy Dak Prescott for something very, very cheap. I mean, some leagues he's probably going to be dropped. So it might be worth at least seeing if you can get him. Add Demario Douglas. Demario Douglas got off to a really slow start this season, but things have started to turn around. Over his last 4 games, he has target shares of 37.5%, 9.4%, that was a bad one, 30%, and 29%. Now, his targets aren't going to be of the highest quality, but plenty of you are looking for depth and you're looking for fill-ins. And Douglas has now become a high floor solution. And you know, it's funny, I was thinking about this and thinking about Drake May and what he did in college. He used Josh Downs, his slot receiver, a lot at North Carolina. Maybe Demario Douglas has that in him. Maybe this could be a Drake May thing moving forward too. At the very least, in week 7, he has a great matchup against the Jags. So you can add Demario Douglas. Add Drake May. So speaking of that Patriots-Jags game, and speaking of Drake May, he could be a decent streamer this week. The Jags defense currently ranks as the best opponent for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. They've given up 8.7 more points per game than their opponent's season-long averages. That means that when quarterbacks face Jacksonville, they basically see a 9-point bump from their season-long average. Jacksonville is the best matchup for quarterbacks you can find. And every quarterback that's faced Jacksonville has exited the week with a QB1 performance. And they face quarterbacks like Deshaun Watson, Joe Flacco, and Caleb Williams. Drake May look pretty good on Sunday, all things considered. So I think that he has a shot to continue that QB1 streak. Add the Cincinnati Bengals defense. As long as Deshaun Watson's starting for Cleveland, we're going to attack this offense with defensive streamers. And this week it's Cincinnati. The Browns have allowed the 4th highest pressure rate this season and the only defense to not have success against them, to not have at least 3 sacks, was the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's why they're the best offense for opposing defenses by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Cincinnati's a little bit healthier on that side of the ball now, and they looked good against the Giants in week 6. As road favorites, I don't think they're a bad streaming choice. So I've got a bonus transaction for you this week thanks to James Cook missing Monday night's game, and that's to add Ray Davis. Davis looked great on Monday night without Cook. He handled 83% of the team's running back rushes, he caught 3 passes, he scored 18.2 PPR points. He looked great on the ground, but he showed off his receiving skills too. When James Cook is back, I think the expectation is that Ray Davis will be like a borderline flex play. But this game could have won him some more playing time. And we now know that he's a pretty good handcuff to James Cook. He was a really productive college back. He looked pretty good in the ZAP model within the context of draft capital. I don't think this performance was some fluke. He looked really good, and we could see more of a tandem in that Bills backfield moving forward. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends Show. I'll talk to you then.